Hello, friends. You're watching part 3 of our grand 10-episode epic on the Napoleonic Wars. In the last part, we witnessed the lightning campaign of 1805, Austria's catastrophe at Ulm, Napoleon's triumph at Austerlitz, and the naval tragedy at Trafalgar, which forever reshaped the balance of power in Europe. After Austerlitz, it seemed the French emperor had become invincible. Austria humiliated, Russia retreating, the Holy Roman Empire living out its final days. But at the very heart of Europe, one old military power remained: Prussia, the land of Frederick the Great, the land of iron discipline, drill, and the legendary 18th century army. Prussian generals were convinced Napoleon's army was merely a temporary phenomenon. They believed that one great battle would return Europe to the old order, but they couldn't even imagine how much warfare had changed. Today we will witness one of the fastest military catastrophes in history, the destruction of Prussia in just a few weeks. We will see the battles of Jena and Auerstedt, where French marshals surpassed everything Europe had ever known. Then, a bloody winter campaign against the Russian Empire, the terrible Eylau, where the battlefield literally drowned in blood and snow. And finally, the famous meeting of two emperors on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River. Napoleon and Alexander the First, two rulers of Europe, two future enemies, in maximum detail, chronologically, with maps, numbers, the atmosphere and drama of the age. So settle in comfortably, we begin. Vive l'Empereur! December 1805, after Austerlitz, Napoleon had effectively become the master of continental Europe. Austria was humiliated by the Peace of Pressburg. The Russian army was withdrawing far to the east. French troops stood in Germany, Italy, and Holland. But the greatest blow to the old European order was something else entirely. In 1806, Napoleon definitively dissolved the Holy Roman Empire, a state that had formerly existed for nearly 1,000 years. In its place arose the Confederation of the Rhine, a union of German principalities under French protectorship. For Prussia, this was a shock. Berlin suddenly understood. Napoleon was not merely defeating armies. He was completely redrawing the map of Europe. King Frederick William III of Prussia was an indecisive ruler. He wavered between peace and war. But at court, the so-called war party was growing ever stronger. Its symbol was Queen Louise of Prussia, young, charismatic, and enormously popular. Prussian society was gripped by a genuine anti-French hysteria. Officers sharpened their sabers on the steps of the French embassy. Young noblemen swore to repeat the glory of Frederick the Great. The problem was that the Prussian army lived in the past. Its system had barely changed since the mid-18th century. The generals were elderly veterans of old campaigns. Command remained slow and over-bureaucratized, whereas Napoleon's French army was something else entirely. It moved fast. Corps could act independently. Marshals made decisions right on the battlefield. Soldiers had been hardened by dozens of campaigns. In July 1806, Prussia secretly joined a new coalition together with Russia, Britain, and Sweden. Napoleon learned of this very quickly, and as always decided not to wait. He understood perfectly his chief advantage: speed. While Prussian generals argued over campaign plans, the Grande Armée was already on the move. Some 180,000 French soldiers marched through southern Germany. It was one of the most effective armies Europe had ever seen. Marshals Davout, Lannes, Ney, Soult, Murat, all of them already had years of unbroken victories behind them. Napoleon told his officers, "The Prussian army has never known defeat, but it soon will." And these words would prove prophetic. In early October 1806, the French army entered Thuringia. Napoleon employed his favorite system: movement in separate corps. Each corps could fight independently for several days, but when necessary, all converged rapidly for the decisive blow. The Prussians, meanwhile, acted chaotically. Their commanders, the Duke of Brunswick, Prince Hohenlohe, and the king himself, constantly changed their plans. They did not know exactly where the main French army was. Napoleon, however, read the situation perfectly. October 14, 1806 became one of the most important dates of the entire era. Two battles at once, Jena and Auerstedt. At Jena, Napoleon believed he faced the enemy's main force. In reality, it was some 55,000 Prussians under Hohenlohe's command. Napoleon had approximately 54,000. The morning was shrouded in thick fog. French troops literally climbed narrow roads up onto the plateau near Jena. Artillery had to be hauled up by hand. But as soon as the fog began to lift, the French attacked. Lannes's corps held the center. Ney charged forward almost without orders, risking encirclement. Napoleon quickly brought up his reserves. Gradually, the French pressure became unbearable. The Prussian line began to break. Then Murat's cavalry entered the battle. Thousands of horsemen smashed through the retreating columns. By midday, Hohenlohe's army had effectively ceased to exist as an organized force. But something even more remarkable was unfolding 20 kilometers from Jena. At Auerstedt, Marshal Davout, with only 27,000 soldiers, unexpectedly ran into the main Prussian army, some 70,000 men. Facing him were the King of Prussia himself and the Duke of Brunswick. Any other general would have begun a retreat, but Davout chose to fight. His Third Corps displayed almost superhuman resilience. French infantry withstood attack after attack. Prussian cavalry could not break the squares. The Duke of Brunswick was mortally wounded. The Prussian command structure collapsed. And in the end, Davout did not merely hold the enemy, he destroyed them. It was one of the most brilliant victories in the history of the French army. Napoleon himself initially could not believe the scale of Davout's success. Prussia's losses were catastrophic, around 25,000 killed and wounded. Another approximately 20,000 taken prisoner. Hundreds of cannon captured. French losses were far smaller. But most importantly, the very psychology of the Prussian state had been broken. An army that for decades had considered itself invincible collapsed in literally a single day. After Jena and Auerstedt, a true collapse began. French troops advanced almost without resistance. Fortresses surrendered one after another. Entire garrisons gave up without a fight. Napoleon made no effort to hide his contempt. This is not war. This is a pursuit. On October 27, 1806, the French emperor made a triumphant entry into Berlin. Once proud Prussia had fallen in just 23 days. Berlin became the symbol of Napoleon's triumph. It was here that he decided to strike at his principal enemy, Britain. On November 21, 1806, Napoleon signed the Berlin Decree. Thus was born the Continental Blockade. The idea was simple yet sweeping. If France could not defeat Britain at sea, it would have to destroy her economy. All ports of Europe controlled by France or its allies were closed to British goods. British ships were forbidden from entering continental ports. Trade with England was declared illegal. Across the map of Europe, a vast economic system emerged under French control. From Italy to Holland, from Germany to Poland. Napoleon was convinced a few years of blockade and the British economy would collapse. But the problem lay elsewhere. Europe itself depended on British trade. Smuggling flourished. Merchants lost their profits. Prices rose. And in time, the Continental Blockade itself would become one of the chief causes of the empire's future catastrophes. But in 1806, it looked like yet another stroke of genius. Meanwhile, Prussia was effectively dismembered. Napoleon stripped away half its territory. On the Polish lands, the Duchy of Warsaw was created. In the west, the Kingdom of Westphalia was established for Napoleon's brother Jérôme. The French Empire kept growing, and it seemed that no one was any longer capable of stopping it. But in the east, a new danger was gathering. The Russian Empire had not yet lost the war. Winter 1807. The French army entered East Prussia. Here, Napoleon encountered a very different adversary. General Bennigsen's Russian army did not collapse after a single defeat, as the Prussians had. The Russians retreated slowly, maintaining order and constantly counterattacking. The campaign turned into an exhausting winter war. Soldiers froze in the snow. Food was scarce. Roads turned into a sea of mud and ice. And then, February 1807, the small town of Eylau. On February 7th and 8th, one of the most terrible battles of the age unfolded there. Some 75,000 French against 78,000 Russians. Heavy snowfall almost completely blotted out visibility. Cannon fired blindly through the blizzard. The wounded froze to death on the battlefield. French attacks faltered. Russian artillery inflicted enormous losses. At one point, the center of Napoleon's army was on the verge of being broken through. And then the emperor ordered Murat to attack. More than 10,000 cavalrymen surged forward. It was one of the largest cavalry charges in history. Cuirassiers, dragoons, hussars flew through snow and smoke, crashing into the Russian lines. The battlefield dissolved into chaos. The cavalry literally carved a corridor through the center of the Russian army. But even this did not bring final victory. The battle raged until nightfall. The losses were appalling. Approximately 20,000, 25,000 men on each side. Thousands of bodies were left lying in the snow. For the French, it came as a shock. For the first time, Napoleon's army had not won an unequivocal victory. Eylau became a symbol of the fact that the war was changing. The empire was beginning to pay an ever higher price for its victories. After Eylau, both armies were exhausted. For several months, maneuvering, local engagements, and preparation for a new decisive blow continued. Napoleon awaited reinforcements, and when they arrived, he went on the offensive again. On June 14, 1807, the French army met the Russians at Friedland. The date was symbolic. Exactly 3 years earlier, Napoleon had won at Marengo. Now he sought another great victory. Bennigsen's Russian army occupied a dangerous position near the Ala River. Retreat was difficult. Napoleon immediately spotted the opportunity. He concentrated his forces against the Russian left flank. French artillery opened a devastating fire. Marshal Ney's infantry broke through the positions. Russian units began retreating toward the bridges. But panic swept through the town. The bridges were overwhelmed. Cannon became stuck. Soldiers threw themselves into the water. French cannonballs literally mowed down the crowds at the river's edge. Russian army losses reached approximately 20,000 men. The French lost around 8,000. It was a decisive victory. Alexander I understood. Continuing the war could end in catastrophe. The Russian Empire decided to open negotiations. On June 25, 1807, the world witnessed a scene that would enter history. In the middle of the Niemen River, a special raft with a pavilion was erected. That was where the two most powerful rulers of Europe were to meet, Napoleon Bonaparte and the Russian Emperor Alexander I. Both arrived by boat from opposite banks. Europe held its breath. When the emperors met, they behaved not as enemies, but almost as friends. Alexander was young, charismatic, and in awe of Napoleon's genius. Napoleon, for his part, saw in the Russian Tsar a potential ally. They talked for hours, discussing politics, war, the future of Europe. According to legend, Alexander said, "I hated you, but now I love you." Napoleon replied, "Then we must be allies." On July 7, 1807, the Treaty of Tilsit was signed. Its terms completely reshaped the balance of power in Europe. Russia recognized all of France's conquests. It joined the Continental Blockade. Prussia lost nearly half its territory. The Duchy of Warsaw was created, a new Polish state under French influence. France and Russia effectively became allies. For a brief moment, it seemed as though Europe was divided between two emperors. Napoleon reached the peak of his power. His influence stretched from Spain to Poland. He controlled or dominated nearly the entire continent. But beneath the outward brilliance, the seeds of future troubles were already hidden. The Continental Blockade was generating ever-growing discontent. Prussia dreamed of revenge. Russia had no intention of remaining France's junior partner forever. And in Spain, a new catastrophe was already brewing. 1807 was the peak of Napoleon's empire. It seemed he had defeated everyone. Austria crushed. Prussia humiliated. Russia turned into an ally. Europe lay at the feet of the French emperor. But it was precisely at this moment that Napoleon began making the mistakes that would ultimately destroy his empire. The Continental Blockade demanded complete control over every port in Europe. And when Portugal refused to submit, French troops crossed the border. Thus began the Peninsular War, a war that would become a true open wound for France. Guerrilla warfare, British expeditions, endless attrition. Meanwhile, Austria was already preparing a new bid for revenge. In Part 4, we will see the eruption of the Spanish uprising, the Battle of Aspern-Essling, Napoleon's first genuine defeat on the battlefield, and the Grand Wagram Campaign of 1809. Friends, which event of the 1806-1807 campaign struck you most? The lightning destruction of Prussia, the bloody carnage of Eylau, or the legendary meeting at Tilsit? Write in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss the continuation of our great history of the Napoleonic Wars. See you in Part 4, the Peninsular War, the Fifth Coalition, and Napoleon's first great defeat.